Good morning once again, and good afternoon and good evening, depending where you're joining us from. I'm Dr. Iona Hine, the Communications and Programme Manager here with Cambridge Interfaith Programme. And it's my pleasure to open this fourth online session, this final session in our anniversary mini-series, but by no means the end of these anniversary-led conversations. And it is a panel on between religion and theology. Just before I hand over to Esra, who will be chairing this panel, I did want to take a moment to mention some people who couldn't be here. The reason I chose this moment to mention them is that several of them were invited to participate in this panel, and unfortunately they just couldn't make it. So I want to mention Nick Adams, a former academic director here with Cambridge Interfaith Programme, and an important force in terms of securing the trust and goodwill that has enabled many of the sort of ongoing aspects of our programme. I want to mention also Mike Higton. I'm not sure I should say this, but I will. Mike was coming. I invited him to be on the panel, and he suddenly told me he wasn't coming. So I hope that it wasn't the topic that put him off. But no, I know he actually wanted to be here, and he's sorry not to be here. I also tried to persuade Rachel Muirs, who collaborated with Mike, editing a volume on around scriptural reasoning. Rachel has just become a professor at the University of Edinburgh and is therefore excused because of the manifest difficulties of moving oneself from one's life sort of 200 miles, I think, leads to Edinburgh, whilst also maintaining teenagers in Edinburgh. But she does send us a message, and she has authorised me to read the message, so I will. Congratulations to the whole CIP team, past and present, on making the vision a reality and the reality a lasting legacy. CIP is a wonderful example of creative and boundary-crossing work in the study of religious traditions, of the kind that helps to realise the enormous potential and gifts of our subject for today's world. One other person that I want to mention just briefly is Laurie Zoloth, who would have been with us yesterday and did contribute by helping select the text that was used as part of the Jewish text, the Hebrew Bible text that came as part of the scriptural reasoning session held here in Cambridge yesterday. And I am sure there are many people not named who also have played roles in both developing the possibility that CIP could come into being, because, of course, the conception comes before the birthday, and also in realising and continuing to realise its potential. So, with no further ado, I hand over to Professor Esra Özyürek, our Sultan Qaboos Professor of Abrahamic Faiths and Shared Values here at the University of Cambridge, and ask her to introduce our fellow panellists and take us forward in this conversation.
Okay. Obviously, CIP has been the joint effort of so many people who really contributed to it over the years. I'll start by asking questions, everyone, about, the original conception, how they have seen their place in it. And then we'll talk about the Cambridge context, and we'll then talk about the British context and how it's CIP's relationship to the Anglican Church. And then we'll also talk about its relationship to its, the UK coming after the British Empire. So we'll also think about the colonial, post-colonial, decolonial possibilities, the connections that CIP have, what's its past, what's its potential into the future. So, this will be the themes that we will follow through today. Okay, Ben, so we heard yesterday that you are one of the people who originally thought about the CIP. So what was the original vision, and especially in relation to the University of Cambridge? What do you think has been unique about it?
Thank you, Esra. And in a sense, Tim has said much of this already in his opening statement. one of the things I think that perhaps articulates some of what he was saying in a slightly different but compatible way, and this draws also on David's work about the future of theology and religious studies in the university, which was a project we ran for the Millennium Year. It became a festschrift for Nicholas Lash, our former colleague, who's the Norris Hulse professor here at the time. And that was the product of 2 or 3 years of intensive thought. The conference emerged out of that, and the book then emerged out of the conference, about how to think about the relation of theology and religious studies. In fact, we preferred at that time to talk about the study of theology and religions, but it's a bit cumbersome as a degree title. But it captured more of the sense of how study was something that we were doing in relation to all of these fields. And one of David's formulations, which I think constantly played a part also in the conception of CIP, was that questions of truth, meaning, and practice should ideally be pursued in a number of ways at once and alongside each other. These questions of truth, meaning, and practice should be pursued as they are asked about religious traditions, as they are asked within religious traditions, and as they are asked between religious traditions. And in some sense, and this is in a way perhaps certainly to oversimplify, but perhaps to put it out there partly so that we can then disagree or dismantle it, complexify it. You might say that religious studies is especially strong about questions of truth, meaning, and practice as they are asked about religious traditions. And theology is especially strong on the within. And what CIP was seeking to offer was the between. And actually, our conviction, and it remains my conviction, is that you can't have good about unless you have a good within and between, or at least you can't have a good about unless you have some sense of the within. You can't have good between unless you have a good sense of within. And so the sort of theological needs to be part of the mix. And so that's the sort of starting point, and that's something that the betweenness is something we were questing for with CIP and seeking to embody and institutionalize. And this came up actually again at King's, where I work now, when we were trying to reframe our undergraduate degree programs from 3. We used to have a theology track, a philosophy and ethics track, and a religion and politics track. And we had to reduce those to 2. And the way in which I found myself arguing we should gather that what had been 3 into 2 was that we should have a philosophy, theology, and ethics track, which in a sense was asking the sorts of questions that philosophy, ethics, and theology most naturally ask. Questions about metaphysics and ethics, the sort of world we're part of and how to live in it well. And then a religion, politics, and society track, which more often asks about the sorts of things that religions are and how they've shaped the past and continue to shape the present. They're different, but nevertheless, I think, mutually fertilizing.
Okay. Thank you so much. Ankur, you held the mantle generously, in the interim period. You work on Hindu-Muslim relations, so you do a bit of Abrahamic religions, but you are our, Hinduism specialist. So how was it for you, that interim period? And what do you think about especially Hinduism in relation to CIP?
Yeah, so I think I was the acting director between the middle of 2016 and 2018. I say I think because I was trying to remember what it was, and I think that's right. So regarding the relation of CIP and these traditions like Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, and others, I think one of the main challenges that we faced in those years, and to some extent we still face it now, is how to extend the ambit or the umbrella of CIP to include, engage with these religious, philosophical, spiritual traditions, such as the ones I mentioned. And one of the things that I was thinking about in those days is that part of the reason why we have this problem is just, a whole load of historical reasons having to do with our academic profile and our teaching capacity. And it's possible next year we will be able to make an appointment which will slightly shift the academic composition, and we will be able to move ahead in that direction. So in answer to your question, I thought I would just share a few of my reflections on CIP and these traditions. Nowadays, sometimes you will hear this distinction, which is often presented as a binary opposition between so-called Abrahamic religions and so-called dharmic faiths. So I say so-called because I've never been able to understand what the binary really means. Nowadays, my designation is lecturer in Hindu studies, and I try my best to live up to my designation. But if you ask me at 6 a.m. in the morning, what does it really do? Where is your heart? Where does it lie? I see myself as a comparative philosopher of religion. So I study patterns of philosophical reasoning across Hindu, Muslim, and Christian worldviews. So from my disciplinary lens, I see many, many differences, but I don't see any binaries. So there's a small note on my door these days, which says in 3 South Asian languages I work with, simply this: whenever possible, translate. And I add the caveat, whenever possible, because there are cases where translation may become very difficult, even break down. Say, can the Christian doctrine of the atonement be translated into Hindu idioms? Maybe yes or maybe no. Can the Christian mystery of the incarnation be translated into Muslim idioms? Maybe yes or maybe no. So in navigating these spaces, these terrains, these landscapes of so-called Abrahamic religions and so-called dharmic faiths, I always find myself right in the middle of the fire between both sides. That they say, you are the lecturer in Hindu studies, so you better come and give a lecture on dharmic faiths. And I say, I don't understand what the binary is to begin with. How do I say that I'm going to choose one when I myself am in the middle? Right? So just to give you 2 examples, say nowadays in the USA, in North America, there is a learned society, as they call it there, called the Society of Hindu-Christian Studies, and they have their meetings at the annual meetings of the AAR every year. So if you go to their meetings, you won't have any sense that there is a dharmic faith discussing something with an Abrahamic religion. These are professors of Hinduism, sometimes from Christian backgrounds, and we all meet together and discuss. So that's about Hindus and Christians. Regarding Hindus and Muslims, because you mentioned I work on this field as well, for about the last 20, 25 years, not maybe 25, 20 years, I have been playing this language game with my Muslim friends and acquaintances. I tell them that theologically speaking, and by theologically I mean the logos of theos, the logic of making statements about God, Muslims are much, much, much closer to Hindus and to Christians. And when I say this, I get 2 kinds of responses. So response 1 is my Muslim friends and acquaintances are shocked, bewildered, like astounded. They throw the book at me. The people of the book, don't you notice? And ask them, how much Hindu theology have you read? None. That's response 1. And response 2, that's very interesting. It's an intriguing idea you have proposed. Let me go back and think about it. And these are people who have studied Hindu theology. So I am not suggesting that Christians and Muslims should stop talking to each other. My point is that if Christians and Muslims were to speak also to Hindus, they would find something that is pleasantly surprising and deeply challenging. So maybe in 20 years from today, 2042, when we look back on where we are now, we will be able to revisit this topic of the so-called dharmic faiths and the so-called Abrahamic religions. And this is especially important because there are many people out there who accept this binary who have this color coding. So they will say dharmic faiths, color coding green, like ecological, very green stuff, peaceful, like promoting ecological sensibilities. And Abrahamic religions, color code red, it's danger, don't go there. And when people who accept this binary on this end, they look at us, they may think, I told you this thing about these Abrahamic guys. They're so narrow-minded, they keep on moving inside their own family. They don't reach out. Of course, that's not the reason why we don't. As I said, this is because we don't have the teaching capacity or academic profile. But if you really want to challenge or interrogate this binary, then I suppose this could be one way forward at CIP.
Okay, thank you. That has been inspiring. Okay, Daniel, you came here in 2011 from the
10,
US.
yeah.
10, okay. So try to remember that time. What did you make of CIP and how was it for you coming from American context? I don't know if there you were actively interested in interfaith thinking, but anyway, how was it for you, this shift?
No, great. That's a good question. So I had done my PhD prior to coming here at the University of Virginia as working with Peter Oakes, and so I had encountered scriptural reasoning there in an American context. And there, the name of the department was the Department of Religious Studies. And so then coming to the UK, now I'm in the department, the Faculty of Divinity. So you can ask what was the relation there. And one thing that I learned upon arriving is that actually Cambridge having a Faculty of Divinity is a very unusual name even within the UK. That there are often faculties or departments of religious studies or faculties or departments of theology. And I learned that oftentimes, drawing upon Ben's notion of analyzing about religious traditions within or between, it oftentimes in departments of religious studies in the UK, it tends to be more of the about, say, social scientific approaches. And then with departments called theology, it tends more to be the within. And that's not always the case so sharply, but that as tendencies. And I really learned, I think from coming here, that the Faculty of Divinity, having that name, is neither just theology or religious studies, but it has sought to bring both of those approaches together rather than falling on that binary. And my experience then in connection with CIP was really the key element in the faculty for really helping that to take place, because the element of the between that CIP does, I think, is the part that adds to that seeking to combine the about and the with. And the way in which, especially say just in different forms, taking the example of scriptural reasoning. When you have aspects of scriptural reasoning of people from different religious backgrounds and trainings engaging with one another, there's a sense in which they bring all of who they can bring all of who they are. They can bring their theological commitment and their academic expertise to the discussion. But there's something that when you have people of different theological commitments engaging with one another across with that between, it then automatically brings in this question of even if one person is taking a internal theological approach to their own tradition, once they encounter someone from another tradition, then they have to ask, okay, what is, they're looking at it from the outside. So these practices that are simultaneously combining the sort of, you could say, inside view with the view of a tradition from the outside and being seen and seeing that, there's that element, I think, of CIP that really combines all of those, which I found very exciting and was able to build on the aspects I had encountered in the U.S. One other element I would note is that the role that CIP, I think, plays within the faculty, say for myself, as someone who studies Jewish studies. So when I was hired to teach Jewish studies in the faculty, and my role in the faculty is basically teaching about Judaism from the year 200 to the present. So a very short time span. But that's to say that currently I'm the only person, a full-time faculty member, teaching Judaism in that context. And so that could potentially be something more isolating. If you have a faculty setup where everyone studies, they're focused on what they study within one religious tradition, then if there are multiple people studying Christianity, then they would talk with one another. But say if there's only one person studying Judaism or only two people studying Islam, then the conversation would be much more narrowed and siloed and potentially isolating. And I think that's where CIP has played such a key role by specifically seeking to foster these elements of not only conversations across people from, say, religious studies methodologies and theological methodologies, but also from people who are studying different religious traditions and saying, oh, actually, there's an important value there. That, I think, has been very important for me as not coming into a faculty and feeling isolated, that this faculty only does Christian theology or only does religious studies. That I think that's been one key thing. And I've also had actually other colleagues say to me, people coming from studying from, say, Christian theological approaches, that the importance of having the between within a faculty, especially in the UK today, because if a faculty, especially in a much more secularized society, if a faculty is seen as doing just Christian theology, that could look, people in the broader context could ask, why do we still have this today? Is that something that's only old-fashioned? But whereas when you have people doing Islamic theology, Christian theology, and Jewish theology, and Hindu theology, etc., these once you have that multiplicity in the conversation, then it's not simply something that is linked only to something of a dominant church only, you could say. And I think it then creates a space for Christian theology within the modern British university in a different way. So those are, I think, some of the things I've experienced from being here.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So Safet, I'll ask you a question that's a bit different from what I prepared, but if you feel, yeah, okay, but I can revert to the other question. So you came here from SOAS, and you have been doing the same kind of work, right? You're interested in, this PhD project that you have developed here, religious plurality in Bosnia, whatnot. So maybe I can ask you that question. How was it for you coming to CIP from SOAS, as we try to contextualize CIP and understand what is unique about it?
That's a great question. Actually, Hina, Khalid, and I were discussing this last night at dinner. And by the way, I just wanted to make sure that we mentioned Hina Khalid, who's part of our team, amazing upcoming conference that she's organizing, Searching for the Sacred. If you haven't seen the program, it's very ambitious. It looks amazing. It's a 2-day conference. And amongst other things, kind of approaching these interfaith relations, including kind of in the Indian subcontinent between Islam and Hinduism and so on. But we were discussing this last night, and it seems in Cambridge like some things are radical. When you mention them, and even I mentioned trans-cosmologies, but it really is radical. Certain conversations are radical for the University of Cambridge. For SOAS, they are not. For SOAS has a certain, and so there's kind of a work that we need to do, I think, and that's part of the decolonizing of the curriculum and of the university and stuff that we are, committed to. So I worked at Goldsmiths, at the University of Bristol, at SOAS, and Cambridge. And it, as you say, it was the same kind of work, but then how do you kind of articulate it for different kinds of audiences and also for different kinds of contexts? And you don't, as I said, I didn't use interfaith relations necessarily as this phrase. And then I decided that there would be something that would maybe transcend these different contexts, and it was really encounter, focusing on encounter and this notion of relation. That perhaps can then speak in various ways, and not simply about interfaith relations and encounters, but in terms of gender, in terms of class, in terms of kind of political structures and so on. Supernatural beings and encounters with supernatural beings is something that I'm very interested in. So finding these, and I would say they're kind of like heuristic devices that then can, kind of perhaps lead into the specificities of what is my field work, which is not always, very interesting for everybody, but, these kind of more abstract ways of speaking about it. Yeah, that's
yeah, it is. It has been my experience too that University of Cambridge or maybe our faculty or CIP is insular from some of the discussions that are taking place in other universities. So I'm invested in bringing more discussions into CIP that are taking place in other universities. Okay, so Simone, hello. Your work is actually exactly where, one of the places where I would hope to take CIP, because you're interested in intersection of theology, religion, and, global challenges at this moment of climate emergency. What can study of religion offer, indigenous religions can offer to us? So what kind of a potential you see in CIP in moving that direction in relation to your work?
Thank you so much. Can you hear me well enough, by the way?
Yes.
Good. Yeah, I thought about this in terms of potentials, but also dangers. So the planetary emergency that we're now in is one that calls for radical co-laboring, which is a word I'm using specifically, and I'll come back to it, across cultures, but also religions and species. And this is a question where shared belief or even worldview actually can be very unhelpful and give the impression that it's only possible to mobilize collective action if everyone believes the same thing or is on the same page or sharing the same agenda. And here, of course, I see interfaith, especially the model of CIP, as an exemplar, because it's emphasized the meeting of different positions, and it's valued above all, as I interpret it, co-presence rather than agreement. But there's also a danger here. Actually, it's in the between that Ben was talking about, in that what part of what the anthropologist Marisol de la Carena calls co-laboring is a practice of being open to being changed through encounter and through working together. So all too often, interfaith becomes a question of, I'll come back to this, having these different positions that speak with each other but remain sort of somewhat isolated. So it's a question of politeness, of politely disagreeing, which is another way, of course, of forcing agreement. One agrees to disagree. So perhaps part of the problem or the potential danger is the inter and interfaith, because this preposition then sort of situates the discussion between positions whose own identity is static. And a concept such as trans faith, perhaps riffing off Tillich's trans theism, but thinking in a different direction, may be more fitting if we are talking about not only the meeting of distinct faiths, but also about going beyond whatever it is about one's own personal faith that stands in the way of a future worth living for. And I think that's also what Safet was talking about with trans cosmologies. So in practice, because I think speaking about these things without giving practical examples is often a problem as well. I think this can take a variety of forms. And I was thinking before our discussion about two examples. One that may be familiar for some of you because it began in Cambridge. It's a Cambridge-led initiative from Selwyn College that took off a few years ago and concerned the establishing of a climate observatory run on citizen harvested data facilitated by the Anglican Church of Melanesia in the Solomon Islands. So this is a complex grassroots project where Christian prayers, liturgy, and worship become inseparable from a scientific faith, a different kind of faith that's very important in these interfaith discussions, the scientific faith and data crunching, and where above all, coming back to Esra, what you were asking about, ancestral faith and indigenous wisdom concerning the land and its inhabitants, human and non-human and more than human, continually shape and reshape both the Christianity and the science in question. So this is an example to me of something like trans faith practice. The second example is more personal and is one that I'm involved in right now in Oslo, so I thought I'd bring it up. It's something I'll be rushing off to right after I've attended this panel. It kicks off at 4 p.m. in Oslo, and it's where an artist ritualist named Jessica Ullevål Sæther is going to undergo a public ritual of initiation in order to mark the formal adopting of her, she is being adopted by the river Akerselva, which is the largest and most prominent river in Oslo. She's going to adopt it as her mother or recognize it as her mother. So the event in Norwegian is called Elvemor, River Mother. And presiding over the initiation will be Irena Rose, who is a Maori woman and traditional healer who lives now in Sweden, married to a Swede. Irena is herself a daughter of the Wanganui River in New Zealand and has worked for decades advising environmental policymakers on the ecological nature of ancestral faith practices and basically advocating for what I've been describing as trans faith. So after Irena confers the initiation on Jessica, Jessica will then have the permission from the river to baptize, this is a word that's being used provocatively and deliberately by Jessica, other persons either in Akerselva or in other rivers. And of course, I'm going to also be doing this ritual later on. So we have this complex crossing of faiths concatenating in the event of co-laboring, because this is a ritual that was born out of a now almost decade-old global initiative that you may have heard of granting legal personhood to inanimate non-human entities, such as rivers, lakes, trees, and mountains, but waterways have become particularly popular and also significant because of water scarcity and the significance of water and the fact that we are made up of water as mammals. So we have Irena's ancestral practices, we have Oslo's Norwegian state Christianity, the spiritual context of today's Akerselva, there's a church nearby, and then we have Jessica's self-identified spirituality that you might describe in a million different ways, and that complex mass of faith rituals, of course, called the law, which is the other kind of faith that is being crossed in this practice. So I think those are the two examples that I thought of that speak to the ways in which, when CIP sort of moves forward, it thinks itself in a bigger context of trans faith practices.
Well, thank you so much for this very inspiring invitation to think bigger and and also addressing more about the emergent problems in front of us. Thank you so much. Okay, next I have a question to all of you. So anyone who wants to take it up can raise their hand. Selfishly, this is a question I've been thinking about, but I'm hoping that, it really relates to CIP and its position in this society. I'm a latecomer to this country. Now it is my 9th year, maybe not, I cannot say I arrived recently anymore. So this is what I have been thinking. Coming here from Turkey and Germany, especially, the US is different. It is really striking that the religious difference is managed better, right? For example, I know lots of Muslims who move here from Germany and France because it's easier to be a Muslim here, or it's easier to be visibly different. It's easier. You can really rise up in this country, something that couldn't happen in France, for example. So on the one hand, that is amazing. On the other hand, if we think about the British Empire, and if we look at the places where the biggest religious violence is happening, are all former British colonies, right? Think about, what is happening in India, I don't know, Iraq, Israel, Palestine, I don't know, many other places we can name. And, scholars also tell us that this is a heritage of the British Empire, right? The divide and rule policy, putting emphasis on religious difference, putting themselves up on each other. And then, there is this past, and at the same time, Anglican Church takes also pride on promoting interfaith relations. They do a good job, but I also sometimes feel like there's a disconnect between this past that has really horrible consequences for today, and then managing it today better for bringing peace, right? So this management actually brought us war, and it can also bring us peace. Anyway, so I find often myself thinking through this dilemma or different sides of the coin. So you don't have to take this line of thinking, but my question is, what do you think about CIP in relation to the Anglican Church, and also CIP as a British institution with the British Empire also as its past? What kind of connections does it have to colonialism, and what kinds of also decolonizing possibilities CIP has for us? I'm sorry, it's a big question, but you can start or address any corner of it.
It's an excellent question. It's a huge question.
It's a huge question.
So as the Anglican priest
yes.
on the panel,
Okay.
I'm conscious that, of course, that one of the habitual vices of Anglicanism is complacency, or it has been. And so it's very important to acknowledge the things that you've been saying about the way in which the Church of England historically has enjoyed privileges that other Christians haven't enjoyed, let alone other religious traditions, and enforced uniformity. And also it's offered a sort of spiritual justification of Britain's ruthless pursuit of economic and military advantage around the world. So all of those things I think have to be ignored by sort of parsing it as the sort of spreading of the gospel of light to these benighted corners of the empire. So all of that sort of needs to be acknowledged. Perhaps on the more positive side, which may speak to all its possibilities for constructive, productive life. Here, I'm entirely indebted to Tim and his thought about this. But it seems to me, and please, I hope Tim will have a chance to come in on this. But it seems to me that one of the benefits of the fact that the Anglican Church, the Church of England, is born out of a historical settlement which seeks to manage religious difference, has meant that it's sustained over a number of centuries a particular attention to religious difference and its management. So, so the sort of standoff between, broadly speaking, more sort of Roman Catholic options and more Puritan ones required, and this is all from Tim, required a set of negotiations between what you might think of as more authoritarian tendencies, models of the church that were more, whose instruments of unity were both sort of statutory and sacralized on the one hand, and conceptions of the church that were led by ideas of freedom of conscience, and yet paradoxically often codified in doctrinal systems, systems of right belief, confessional statements, whereby a sort of right belief was the condition of church membership. And oddly, the Church of England has elements of those, and it recognises that the due ordering of bishops, priests, and deacons, is an institutional norm that must be sustained. It's got that sort of Catholic bit. It has the 39 Articles of Religion, which has that confessional bit. But in an odd way, it's the third part of the way that the Church of England defines itself, which is the Book of Common Prayer, which has been the embodiment of its continuities. So the gathering of people of all different conditions, all sorts and conditions of men, as the Book of Common Prayer puts it, for the regular worship of morning and evening prayer or Holy Communion is a way of saying that very widely divergent groups of people ought to be able to offer their gifts at the same altar and receive grace in the same way. They ought to make their common supplications together. They ought to be able to make thanksgivings in general thanksgiving. And in this sense, their differences are managed within a sort of framework of practice. And that's, I think, the main thing I want to say. There's a sort of historical self-awareness in Anglican ecclesiology, combined with a practice-led ecclesiology, which relativizes the claims of doctrinal purity or institutional authority, and prioritizes sustainable local practice, and a constant attention to context, which I think was coming out in what Tim said yesterday. So it's not just congregations, it's localities. So there's an ethnography about Anglican parish life, which requires those who are responsible for the cure of souls in a place to hold that responsibility for everyone who lives there and to attend to the place and its landscapes and so on. So these are the sort of positive aspects, I think, that lend themselves to, that can be put to the service of thinking more broadly about the relations between religious traditions, not just within English Christianity. And the last thing I would say is actually to quote Tim from the academic profile, where he says, this is a bit he wrote, where he says that when he was talking about the second phase of secularism that he reminded us of yesterday, which has been such a dominant feature of political life in Western Europe, and we might say causes some of the problems we might see with laïcité in France and so on, that it constitutes one of the major terms of religious conflict with Western ideals, this second phase of secularism, for it commands little loyalty amongst the various faith groups, and so cannot readily create a polity. It commands little loyalty amongst the various faith groups, and so cannot readily create a polity. And I think the creation of a sustainable polity, which has the buy-in of religious people, was again part of the Elizabethan settlement. It sought, as far as possible, not everybody came in, but the buy-in of religious people, because a polity couldn't be sustained without that buy-in. And I think that's the sort of aim of a proper pluralism in English and in some way Anglican context.
So in that sense, do you see CIP kind of following that?
Yes, so I think the prioritization of attention to context, of historical alertness, the caution about rule books, theology being sets of rules, but actually interventions, we were talking about yesterday, interventions and attempts at repair, all of that is part of the sort of long history of the Anglican Church dealing with the Reformation. And there's a wisdom, if you like, in that long history that can be adapted and put perhaps to new work. That would be my suggestion.
Okay, thank you. Daniel.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think building on Ben, I think it's interesting, it's sort of, you could say the aspects, some of what I've seen with, again, moving to the UK in 2010 from a former British colony, namely the United States, but I guess that's in a distinct way. But actually seeing the differences in the way in which religion functions in the UK and religious plurality versus the US, that the aspect, for instance, the US has no established church, whereas the UK does. And yet, as Esra said, that there might be the case that the UK, either despite or because of the established church, handles religious plurality in certain ways in a better way, or people experience it better than, say, in France or Germany in certain ways. And so I think this, the element of the institutional factor of the Anglican Church and how that could connect to institutional factors of empire, etc. I think it's important to highlight both the really problematic aspects of the past and not to shy away from that. And then also to say, but wait, are these intermixed with some things that have possibilities for better ways of living today? And I think this aspect of that Ben mentioned of repair, reparative critique or redemptive critique, you could say, of on a theological level of redeeming things from the past and not simply negating them, I think is an important element that I've seen within CIP as well. This element of the certain type, and I think it relates to Simone's point before, about not interreligious encounter not simply being hermetically sealed entities asking questions to one another, but this possibility of being changed by the encounter. I think the aspect, in a lot of ways that things have been discussed in the past with CIP and with scriptural reasoning, is the idea that by engaging with people from other traditions, you come to see your own tradition in a new light and are then put in a position to engage in aspects of repair without negating it entirely. It's not about there are these problems in my tradition, so let's just get rid of everything. But actually that element of being able to recognize the things that work well and that are intermixed with the things that haven't worked as well, and the elements of being able to make changes or think about possible changes that maintain and preserve key elements that are good and have nurtured meaning and life, while also finding ways of being able to address the elements that have been very problematic, I think can come from this CIP methodology. So I think there's something, it would be interesting to, as we go forward, bring in these questions of, as you talk about, aspects of imperialism or colonialism. In what way, I know you've brought up, in what ways has the notion of interfaith dialogue intersected with those elements? Are some forms of interfaith dialogue simply a tool of colonialism or not? But actually, could there be ways in which, rather than engaging it only in the negating way, looking at the way in which interfaith dialogue has intersected with empire and colonialism, but bringing it in this element of the reparative element? Are there some ways in which even the notion of empire as a sort of universal outlook, looking to different things, could have possibilities, at least for thinking today, that would differ from, say, if you only are looking at one narrow part of the world? So it's this element of looking at the past, looking at the problems, and sometimes it could be in the things that are the most problematic from the past, we can still find resources, at least for thinking with that, to repair those same problems. So so this is I think it is a really important question. I think CIP's past and present projects have resources, I think, for extending to address what the things you've raised.
And I guess it's also a British way anyway, dealing with change without major revolutions, but like, slow incremental changes.
Could be.
Yeah. Ankur, would you have anything
Well,
to say?
I don't have much to add, but because you're talking about empire, I suppose one of the enduring legacies of empire in South Asia is these three nation states, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, with very distinct socio-political identities. I mean, India on paper is a secular republic, and one of the problems of secularism in South Asia and in India is that it is quite difficult to translate the word secularism into languages like Hindi or Urdu or Bengali. I mean, there is no word for that concept. So in Europe or say places like Russia, if I say secular, I could mean I'm not religious. Whereas in a South Asian context, when you say I'm secular, what you mean is that you are not communal. And the word communal has a very different meaning there. That is, if I'm trying to politicize religious differences by saying that if you're a Muslim, you get so many votes, and if you are a Christian, you get so many votes, that is the South Asian meaning of communal. So whereas in Europe, the antonym of secular could be religious, in India, the antonym of secular is communal. And navigating that conceptual shift can take a lot of time in thinking what's happening. But just to add to what has been said, I mean, I think just living in South Asia, it makes you realize that South Asia is a crucible of CIP. I mean, what we do in CIP is what you would have to do anyway on a daily basis if you live in different parts of India or Pakistan or Bangladesh.
Okay, thank you. Safet, do you have anything?
I'm thinking of. I couldn't address the Anglican question, but I know that it's the management of religion was uneven in terms of British colonialism in different parts of the empire, but it was always deep in the sense of kind of the legal systems, the kind of differentiations, and that it lingers in the sense of what Anne Laura Stoller has called imperial debris, which is not only in the environments and these kind of remnants of the empire that kind of linger on, but also in the psyches, and it's kind of a psychological thing that lingers. And so there are all of these things that are that kind of debris that I think very often when we look at when we think of interfaith relations, we are actually rummaging through that kind of debris, and we're dealing with the remnants of that. And I'm thinking of, so there's a wonderful scholar, most all of you know, a colleague also of CIP in the anthropology department, Yael Navarro, who's kind of looked at this kind of these remnants in divided Cyprus, asking what does it feel like to live in another person's house after that, looking at that kind of division line, walking. So these kinds of spaces that are kind of a testament of something that was lost, that was destroyed, but that lingers on in a bodily way. So it's not something that can be, you mentioned kind of this reparative work, and I know you mentioned it, Daniel, in a different way, but Cambridge is kind of doing these small kind of acts that seem like repair, giving a Benin bronze back, a Sami drum back to a sacred drum to the Samis and so on, but it's not something that can be repaired because it's kind of so pervasive and it lingers in such a deep way. So it kind of needs to, and it is in itself, these are interfaith contexts, because very often colonialism itself created kind of syncretic forms. I mean, just think of Mexican religion. And it's because of colonial violence that you have these encounters. So it's kind of very peculiar.
Yeah.
If I could build on that, actually, it's with a Cambridge specific aspect. One thing I learned after coming here, and I think this is correct, maybe others in the room can correct me if not, that actually Cambridge used to have a professorship of Islamic law. So well before there was any Islam being done in the divinity faculty, they had a professorship of Islamic law, I think in the law faculty actually. And when I heard about that, I was surprised. And it turned out the context for that, this is earlier in the 20th century, was because of the colonial context, the colonial regime in India, that the British then set up different courts for different religious groups. And so the Muslims were told, you go to the Muslim religious court run by the British, overseen by the British. And so now we can see the various problems in terms of that. But what's notable then, they had a professorship of Islamic law, which I think was never held by a Muslim. I think it was, it's still, I think, then notable. Then you had someone in Cambridge really studying the details and becoming knowledgeable in all the details of Islamic law. And yes, it was for the colonial purpose. But actually, is there then, despite the problems with that, is there something that can affect the university of saying, actually, having knowledge of Islamic law is an important thing for a university? And I think that's the reparative part, that once you have that tradition in a certain context, but actually some of the things that it embodies can then be transferred to a different context, that separate from the colonial element, but that the fact that it was already normalized in Cambridge that there would be Islamic law studied in its particularity, I think is just one type of example where drawing upon past structures and institutions that had significantly problematic dimensions can be provide resources for the present in these transformed ways. So it's
but also, as you said, being aware of how they came.
Oh right, yeah, without glossing over that. I think that's the key thing. And actually, my notion of talking about repair is not simply trying to put rosy lenses on it. That you only know what needs to be repaired by really looking carefully at what were the problems in the past, how did it come about. So I think one could then name other examples that you could think about for these elements of drawing upon previous things that existed and thinking about them for new contexts. Yeah.
Thank you. Simone, is there any part of this larger question that you want to relate to?
Yeah, I could relate to, I'm thinking about many different things. One is the trickiness of repair, right? That it implies that there is a whole, which isn't always the case when it's about the Anglican Church, for instance, making reparation also in relation to itself. I mean, isn't it more of a question of recognizing that there was perhaps something broken from the beginning? Anyway, those are questions. But I was thinking also about you mentioned, Esra, in the question about decolonizing and using the language of decolonialism. And I'm thinking about the distinction or the movement towards decolonial in relation to like post-colonial, right? So the shift from post-colonial to decolonial is actually one that is very difficult to make as an institution because it demands the rethinking of the power relations of the academy itself. So typically post-colonial will be, I look at the Anglican Church and I say, to this extent, it has been shaped by colonial mentalities, right? And sort of analyze that. And in a way, that's quite safe to do because you can do that within the structures already there as an institution. So you could take the structure of CIP and say, let's have a day reflecting on the extent to which colonial mentalities have shaped, the institution. So why is it mostly about Abrahamic faiths? Well, clearly for colonial reasons, et cetera, right? But the decolonial theory talks about the need to rethink interfaith relations, the concept, from the perspective of what Walter Mignolo famously called the cracks in the world system or the subalternities, right? Rethinking it from that perspective, on those multiple perspectives. And that typically can't really be done within the structures because the structures themselves are a result of a perspective that has suppress the subaltern, right? So it's really tricky, as Daniel was saying, like you then have to try, and if you are within like a paid environment such as a university, you can't leave it because that's unhelpful, but you also have to try and rethink in a way that is constantly aware of everything, like the history in the past, and it's really difficult to do. And I don't really think that, I mean, my constant question, we were having a discussion about this in a different context recently, was like whether it's possible really to do that honestly and productively in a context such as Cambridge with a huge endowment that, I mean, everything about Cambridge is built on colonialism, and that's not to say one shouldn't do it, but I'm just saying it's really very difficult, and it's not something that can only be done as one separate activity, as it were, because it does involve like restructuring the power relationships. And I mean, there was a useful article recently I was reading that talked about the difference between about indigeneity specifically, the difference between indigenous inclusivity in academia, where you sort of allow for more voices, right? Indigenous voices, for instance, diversity, and then shifting from that to making the whole sort of curricula reflect a different sort of set of voices. And then from there to what they call indigenizing, decolonial indigenization, which is where the power relations themselves have shifted in a way so that the academy is sort of unrecognizable actually from what it was before. I mean, you can see this in independent educational platforms that actually have different structures. So yeah, those are just some thoughts on the kind of, I mean, it's exciting because it is very, very challenging, but it is also very different from what we have now.
Yeah, thank you, Simone. So this goes until 1, right? So actually, I mean, all of us in this room, have been working in similar issues. So I will invite everyone to think about it. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, how can we critically think about the space that we occupy? I mean, for 2 days, we have celebrated the wonderful contributions we make to the world. Sure, we do. But also we are built on, power relationships always that, exclude others, that make other relationships impossible also. So, maybe what are some of the things that we can do better? If you have any thoughts, any comments, any questions, yeah, please.
Sorry, wait for the moment.
Oh, sorry.
Hi, I'm Rosie Dawson. Just listening to what Simone was saying just now, and she did say something about read my writing. Educational places which have started to do some of what you've been talking about. And we talk about, the need to get beyond the structures. I just wonder whether any of you can give me some, just give me a really good news story about something that looks very different to how it looked 20 or 30 years ago, or doing something which means it is going to look very different in 30 years' time. I would just love to hear those practical examples.
Well, if I can answer, I feel like it's a big deal that as a Muslim woman, I think it is a big deal that as a Muslim woman, I'm a full professor at the Faculty of Divinity. I think 30 years ago, it wouldn't have happened, right? So it is a major progress. So some transfer, anyway, it is like, as Simone had been saying, we can go towards a more pessimistic place, and then say, well, but at the end, what kind of difference does it do? But at the same time, okay, this has happened because of all the fights that people have been fighting.
But what are the structures that have changed, which means that you are where you are?
I think some of the structures that change, again, you'll see my more pessimistic side, is that universities are becoming more diverse as the value of the university is dropping in the society. As the salaries are decreasing, we have more women. Now we have more ethnically diverse people. For example, now the value of being a doctor is quite low in this country. Why? Chicken and egg. If you go to if you go to the hospital, you will see that it's all immigrants who are doctors, right? So because the value fell, because they entered, value of being a doctor is falling, so it is like that. So the universities are becoming more diverse. And as that is happening, we also have, I don't know, I'm going to where the universities are going, but I think it is also related because we are located in a university. Then we have this big fight about, what is happening to university? They shouldn't be diversified. We should keep it for, all this culture wars is also about that, right?
If I could build on that, I think one example that I'll bring up a topic actually. So if we look at scriptural reasoning, that I think is actually something that has really operated in a different type of structure. And we've talked over the past couple of days about the benefits of scriptural reasoning, the different groups we work with, and lots of people have found it beneficial. But actually, in certain academic contexts, it's actually been seen as problematic. And I think precisely because it challenges certain established academic structures. The notion that with scriptural reasoning, it's a practice that originated in the academic context and is conceived as originally as an academic practice that's then been brought outside the university as well. But within the university, as academic practice, it's received various types of challenge and pushback because of the idea that scriptural reasoning is about people engaging with one another, engaging text together, but actually was set up as something that people bring their academic expertise to the discussions, but it doesn't require that they have to check their theological commitments at the door. It allows people to bring their academic expertise, their commitments as a Jew or a Christian or a Muslim, or as a mother or father, or as all the different elements of their life can come into the discussion. Not only the part that they are the specific get the stamp of academic approval because they have their PhD in that topic. So it combines those elements, and I think some people have reacted then and say, oh, this isn't properly academic, because to be properly academic, it has to be purely based on the elements of expertise and authority. And I think that the way in which scriptural reasoning draws upon expertise or authority, but that's not the only picture, and it allows for people to participate and engage with texts that they're not experts in. I think that is actually something so it's been going on for a while in CIP, but I actually think it's a very structurally radical approach that I think maybe it's still not been fully appreciated, that we're still doing it and building projects in relation to it. But I actually think the theoretical, educational, pedagogical potential that we've been enacting and which has not always been received positively in certain academic contexts, I think that actually still has strong potential for the future, potentially figuring out different forms, but that it would be, I think, one concrete example of changing structures. Yeah.
David.
The test of that will be when you get some of the Old Testament and New Testament colleagues, as they are called in this fact, here involved in scriptural reasoning and CIP. It's absolutely blatant that the guild scholars, and the same is true of Jewish scholars in terms of Jewish scriptures, and the same is true of Quranic scholars, that they do not engage in scriptural reasoning, and it's very, very interesting to ask why. And and there's also the things that Daniel mentioned. But could I just make three little points? I mean, one is that I think it's worth reflecting the change, in terms of CIP and all theology and religious studies and so forth. What is the impact of the impact agenda over the years? I mean, I think that's been extraordinarily important. The fact that now subjects are, have to demonstrate that they're having impact or knowledge exchange or whatever you call it. And I think I'd love to hear what people are thinking about that, because there's different universities as well, there, and Safet has a range of experience in that, and that's one issue. The second one is just money. Could you reflect on money? Because I mean, everything that we did in CIP depended on raising money. Absolutely basic. And the fact that we have a Jewish studies post is because somebody who was Jewish gave money. I mean, and the fact, but also a Muslim gave money to that same post. A quite extraordinary thing. That it was a joint Muslim-Jewish donation. And just how funding operates. I mean, it's one thing to talk about structures as Simone has. She didn't mention a thing about money, and the way money operates in a world where late modern capitalism, how that affects the university is absolutely fundamental. And I'm sitting beside somebody who knows that only too well from London School of Economics, Jim Walters. But the other thing is, I'd love both Daniel and Ben to respond to the fact that, on Anglicanism and also on Judaism, that I mean, I'm an Irish Anglican, and I did have a little bit to do with CIP, and the fact of being from an environment where Anglicanism was a 3% minority in Dublin was very important. All the Jews went to my school in Dublin because they were the minority in a 97%, as it was then, Catholic country. And the fact that the sort of Anglicanism that has informed includes Anglicanism in a minority, not as the established church, I feel, as an Irish Anglican, with its very, very complex colonial history. Let's not go there for now. My brother is a historian of all that, and so I'm immersed in that too. But I'm really interested in how Ben and how Daniel reflects on the fact that it's the scriptural reasoning grew out of Jewish text study. And philosophy and theology, and and in other words, out of a community that has always, for most of history, thought as a minority and had to cope with being a minority, and that's so different from the sort of colonial Anglicanism that we got in the other account.
Thank you. Do you want to respond?
Sure. Yeah, well, I could just start. First of all, I wanted to, it's a great question. I want to just push back slightly on a thing you said in prefacing about the question of people in studying of Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, New Testament scriptural scholars not engaging with scriptural reasoning. I think it is a good point, because there definitely have been various people, the sort of scriptural textual scholars, who have pushed back or not like scriptural reasoning, but we actually have, there are also a range who have engaged, and just in our previous panel on the Meet the Team with Julia Snyder, who teaches New Testament in Cambridge and has been key in CIP, and there are others as well. So I think I think we should be not overgeneralizing. I think it's still good to ask the question: why do some scholars in certain fields push back? But still, it's the case. Then we should also ask the question: actually, if not all the scholars in those sub areas criticize scriptural reasoning, if people in some people in those same sub areas do engage with scriptural reasoning, I think we have to take in both those phenomena and ask, what is it? Are there certain? I would think within every subdiscipline, it's sort of there can be some people approach their topic with a certain spirit, and others with a different spirit, and some with maybe more open. So I think the academy does put certain siloing structures in place, but I think there are ways in which every scholar is also an individual, and the individuals can approach their topic in a wide range of ways that either look beyond their field or stay narrowly within it. So I think it's not either or, but it's still a good point to think about. With your question about minority, I think that's really key, because someone could say David Ford was actively involved in all these elements in the Cambridge Interfaith Programme, and look, he's an Anglican theologian, and the Anglican is part of the established church, so that's the majority, and actually he's from Ireland. He's a Irish Anglican. Actually, he grew up as a minority context. And so I would say, actually, you asked about the Jewish connection, I think that this element of, which we haven't talked as much yet in these 2 days, the aspects of interreligious, interfaith engagement, and how that parallels with a minority-majority dynamics, because I think in the Jewish context, sort of historically, Jews living as a minority have had to enact interreligious engagement just as a matter of course. I mean, this is what Safet brought up also. There are lots of places where it's not something that is done by religious leaders in a specially curated context, but it's just an everyday element. But I think it is the case that thinking about the formation of CIP, the ways in which drawing people able to contribute from this awareness of sort of a minority religious background can play a role in shaping the being able to imagine the idea of interaction across different religious boundaries. That when you're a minority, you have to know, you might know about your own religious tradition, but by default, you end up knowing about the majority religious traditions as well. And so you already are growing up in a sort of a dual knowledge interactional context. And I think so it'd be interesting to look at the history of CIP and an interesting notion of the combination of just people involved in it from more minority religious experiences, but also people from majority religious experience, and what that can bring as well, and the bringing together not only of the Judaism, Christianity, Islam, or engaging with other religious traditions, but the bringing together of people with minority experience and majority experience, and how that type of interaction actually can, especially that type of interaction, and looking forward in relation to aspects of colonialism, those types of dialogue actually are important to keep in mind. So yeah, it's, I think, a really key point.
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting things about the present experience of being an Anglican, a Church of England Anglican, is that we're having to face the fact that we're now a minority. It's been true for a long time, but we're having to face the fact we're a minority in the communion, the Anglican communion, and all sorts of interesting things are happening, therefore, in relation to shifts of power within the communion, as the recent Lambeth gathering demonstrated. And that could mean that the Church of England has to learn from the other parts of the community that have learnt, as it were, wisdom of being a minority. At the same time, I'm really interested, and this is a question, and maybe a hunch. I'm interested in the way that the forms of life that Anglicanism seems frequently to foster or replicate wherever it's been in the world, often have to do with institution building, even when it's been a minority. And I remember, David, you and I attending the meeting of the Anglican primates in 2000 in Portugal, where Anglicans are very definitely a minority, but a presence. We heard from primates from all the provinces of global provinces of the Anglican communion, and there were surprising continuities between them, whether they were a big force or a small one, in the kinds of things often they were investing in, which would include things like schools, universities, hospitals, and so on. And so that's very interesting. Of course, that's not uniquely Anglican or even uniquely Christian, but it was a typical feature of the involvement even of Anglican minorities. So I'm intrigued about whether institution building is in some distinctive ways an Anglican habit, not exclusively, but distinctively or habitually. That will be important if that's the case, as we go into a future where Christianity is going to be a minority in this country and elsewhere, and theology is going to become minority-like in universities and potentially may evaporate, which I think is a real concern. So the questions about where it can migrate to and what forms it will take, the teaching and formation of people in Christian theology is an acute one at the moment. And again, it becomes a question that a minority needs to think through. And of course, lots of intellectual life in the West has been sustained outside university frameworks, in cafes and bars in Vienna, and wherever all the big ideas come from, often not universities, but also in churches and in Chavruta study and in madrasas. Those are the places where I think we should be expecting to find theology sustaining itself if and when university institutional structures are no longer hospitable to it. And I think SR is, as Daniel was saying, is sort of laying some of the groundwork for that to be a possibility, potentially. I mean, I don't want it to be excluded from the university, but it needs to be able to survive if it is.
Yeah, Sarah.
Hi, I have this incredibly dubious honour of having been asked to lead the Anglican Church response in situations of violent conflict over the last 5 years, and I've seen so many strands picking up on the different things that you're bringing, and I just want to allude to 2 or 3 of those. One is the emphasis now on local, not communal, in terms of the Anglican communion writ large. And there's some throwback on that, where countries like Pakistan, Nigeria, South Sudan are saying, hang on a minute, you got us in this mess. You can't now abandon us. So there's a kind of double act going on there in the response to colonialism. But there is a power that's very different. I was working obviously very closely with the Roman Catholic Church in the field. Very, very different response. The Anglican Church, the power is held in country or in region. compared with the Roman Catholic Church. That has the advantage. You've got a ready-made hierarchical system that has many disadvantages as well, but you can, messaging-wise, you can get messages right down to the local parish level very quickly. Within the Anglican Church, you can do that within the Roman Catholic Church, not say within the Islamic community in some of those contexts. But what I wanted to share just very briefly was scriptural reasoning and how that plays out in some of those situations of violent conflict. And I just thought I'd give you quickly two examples. One is South Sudan, where I've witnessed scriptural reasoning playing a vital role ecumenically, because, of course, the conflict is split tribally, and the tribes tend to align with the earliest missionaries. So we've got Presbyterian Nur, and we've got Roman Catholic Dinka, and we've got Anglican smaller tribes, etc. All of them in absolute, violent conflict scenario, being able to come together around scriptural reasoning. And one of the verses that or the parables that we brought to that scriptural reasoning session, we did a whole series, but the one that worked the best was Jesus saying, "I am the gate." And really looking at that whole parable of, about who are the wolves and who are the hired helps and who are the shepherds and what does it mean to be a shepherd of your people, etc. Secondly, scriptural reasoning in both Peshawar and northern Nigerian Kaduna. So that is Muslim Christian scriptural reasoning, looking at very, very practical contemporary issues like what do you do when there's a flare up at a border post? How do you respond as army chaplains, for example? And some of what was coming out of that was this realization that actually we have something we share in response to these situations of conflict. We don't need to stand apart on this. We actually we stand for responding in God's name, not in my own communal name. So that was a very different dynamic playing out. And in Peshawar, just briefly to say, the power imbalance between the Christian community and the Islamic community there is such that the Christian community would say, the Archbishop there would say, just turning up at the scriptural reasoning table is why we need to be there. It doesn't matter what we say or what we do, we just have to turn up, and our presence is the most important thing. So just very, very practical examples of scriptural reasoning. And the last thing to say is with the Anglican Church specifically, it is, of course, oriented towards the global south now. The average Anglican is a young woman in her 20s from the global south. So when we're thinking of Anglican presence in the world today, we need to think of her as well as think of the colonial past and the baggage that comes with the Anglican presence. So.
Excellent. Okay, if there are no other questions, we can finish it. No, yeah, thank you so much for.
Sorry, I have a few words to say.
Go ahead.
If I may step in, then I just didn't want to step over.
Go ahead.
So first of all, I failed at an important thing, and that was to concretely introduce our fantastic panel. So we've had Ben Quash, who was academic convener of CIP in its early years, and for more than a decade now has been Professor of Christianity and the Arts at King's College London. We've heard from Ankur Barua, the senior lecturer in Hindu studies here at the University of Cambridge, and a former director for a brief spell of CIP. We've heard from Simone Kotva, research fellow in theology and earth ethics at the University of Oslo's Faculty of Theology, an affiliated lecturer here, a contributor to our summer school, and an interviewee on the most recent episode in our Religion and Global Challenges podcast. We've heard from Daniel Weiss. He is, as we know, the Coexist Polonsky Senior Lecturer in Jewish Studies. He's also for several years now been the chair of the CIP Management Committee, which is a pretty noble undertaking and one that he gets a brief exemption for, at least at the moment, because he's technically on research leave again for the next couple of terms. We've heard from Safet HadžiMuhamedović, who is presently a teaching associate in the Faculty of Divinity, but who entered the faculty as CIP Research Associate and helped instigate many of our ventures, including the online summer schools. We have, of course, been ably chaired by Professor Esra Özyürek, who I'll say once again is a Sultan Qaboos Professor for Abrahamic faiths and shared values, and our academic director. We thank them all.
Thank you, Ayana.
Thank you.
Since this is the last of the events, I also want to give some other thanks. I want to thank the whole of our management committee for their support of me and of this initiative of having and celebrating our 20th anniversary. I also want to thank some practical people because there's a lot of unseen busyness that goes on. So I want to thank people like Jane Wallace, who does great things in the faculty office. I want to thank Danny Redhead, who is our faculty outreach officer. I'm not going to be able to name everyone, but I want to thank Charity Green, my predecessor, who left me fantastic handover notes while leaving the role in the middle of a pandemic. I want to thank Chris Moses, who also did some work holding down the CIP fort alongside Giles and Daniel in some trickier times. He was with us yesterday, and I think hopefully he is also listening online today. I want to thank Barbara Bennett, who was here yesterday. Barbara was so important to Cambridge Interfaith Programme for a decade and more that sometimes we can speak in terms of needing a Barbara. So to all of those people, to the many people I can't mention because I had so many apologies from people who would have loved to be here and couldn't make it, but we really owe a great thanks. Now, Peter Oakes yesterday sent words where he compared the task of creating CIP to midwifery. Simone referred to co-labouring, and it occurred to me that there was a kind of link there, and of course to collaboration. So when I pitched myself to come and join CIP, I talked about trying to find the stories of ourselves as individuals by which we entered into interfaith relations, because even if we might be doing it as academics, the story that got us here is nearly always involving something about, something more personal, something that engages, something that we can recognize when somebody starts to talk about the small kernel of their childhood. And we recognize those things. And so I'm also seeking the stories of CIP. You've heard some of them from the panels today, but I hope that I get to continue talking with you and capturing what is quite definitely stories and not a story. I will be in touch with you all because I've been given various things that people would like me to distribute to those of you who've been here. I'll do that to the best of my ability. GDPR limits me a little bit, so if you are not already on the CIP mailing list and didn't give your consent upstairs on the nice sign-in sheet, please do make sure I've got your email address and can pass on various things. But I'll just highlight things coming up this month. We've got the Religion in Three Continents panel at the Alumni Festival. That's part of a paid-for stream, so you do have to pay £10, but you get some fantastic panelists and you get access to the other panels in that stream. We've got the Searching for the Sacred Symposium. That's Hina is pulling that off as a postgraduate symposium with 4 postgraduate collaborators, and I'm absolutely in awe of the programme that they've come up with for 2 days. I'm sure their brains are going to be immensely tired by the end of it, but do check that out. So it will be available in parts to watch online. And of course, then we've got the new academic year, and there will be many, many things coming up, including things that are only just nuggets of ideas at the moment, because we're so excited by all the conversations we're having and the possibilities ahead. Thank you all, our audiences, for coming and for helping us make this as wonderful as it has been.